Bueno, pues las 3 en punto y es momento de abrir nuestra nueva sesión, el BUSA, la presidencia Biden, expectativas y realidades comerciales. La nueva administración del presidente Biden introduce muchos cambios, uno de ellos en la economía global. Un incremento en los impuestos de la primera economía del mundo de la mano de la introducción de un impuesto a las ganancias a nivel global hace necesario que llevemos a cabo un análisis detallado a través de diversos expertos. Unos expertos que ya tenemos vía online y que van a ser Luis Leibovich, Shannon Fiura, ya estuvo con nosotros ayer, y Claudia Avila. Y una sesión que va a moderar Eric Autor. Hello, Eric. Hello, everyone. How are you?
Very good, thanks.
Buenas tardes.
I'm going to introduce a little bit of Eric Autor, of your biography in Spanish. Eric Autor es expresidente de la NAFS, la National Association of Foreign Trade Zones. Ha ocupado este cargo hasta este mismo año. De hecho, ha sido ejecutivo de comercio, consejero del Comité Financiero del Senado de los Estados Unidos. Ha practicado la abogacía en bufetes privados y tiene títulos universitarios de la UCLA, la London School of Economics y la Duke University. Eric, whenever you're ready, you can proceed.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. Welcome to this panel discussion on the Biden administration, trade expectations and realities. It's my pleasure to be the moderator of today's session. So just to tee this up, Donald Trump's America First trade policy represented a major break from the long tradition of the Republican Party in the United States in support of free trade, and was a significant shift toward protectionism and managed trade. However, there's scant evidence that Trump's trade agenda was successful in achieving its primary goals of reshoring and expanding American manufacturing and jobs, reducing or eliminating the merchandise trade deficit, and reining in China. Indeed, the weight of evidence supports a conclusion that Trump's trade policy, which resulted in the imposition of billions of dollars in new tariffs, pulling out of trade negotiations, renegotiating existing trade agreements with more restrictive rules, and undermining the rules-based global trading system, had serious negative effects on the U.S. economy, the competitiveness of American companies, American jobs, and American global leadership. Notwithstanding this questionable record, international trade is one policy arena where many Democrats seemed largely in agreement with Trump Republicans. This puts President Biden in a somewhat difficult balancing act between companies and industries frustrated by his inaction in dismantling Trump tariffs, a Democratic base that supports the unilateral, punitive, and high tariff approach of the Trump trade policy, and the need to distinguish his policy from Trump's through his so-called worker-focused agenda. Today, we have a distinguished panel of experts who will discuss these issues and provide their insights on President Biden's trade agenda, expectations, and realities. First, I'd like to introduce Claudia Avila Connolly. Since 2005, Claudia has led the Mexican Association of Industrial Parks, AMPIP, a business organization representing more than 360 industrial parks. She previously served as Secretary of Economic Development in the Mexican state of Hidalgo and as Deputy Trade Commissioner of Mexico in Toronto, Canada, and Stockholm, Sweden. She studied international relations at UNAM in Mexico City, received an MBA at the University of Toronto, and a PhD in strategic management at the Anáhuac University in Mexico City. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Shannon Fiura, a partner in the international trade firm of Page Fiura PC, representing clients in the international trade arena, specifically in the areas of import, export, and supply chain security. Ms. Fiura serves on the executive committee of the board of directors of the National Association of Foreign Trade Zones and is a member of the board of directors of the World Free Zones Organization. Last but not least, we have Louis Leibowitz. Louis is a prominent international trade and customs attorney based in Washington, D.C. He works with clients on international trade investment and trade opportunities and challenges dealing with law and government policy, including practical solutions for clients involving international trade issues. He's a former chair of the NAFTZ and speaks and writes frequently on international trade, legal, and policy issues. So this session is going to be a discussion format, but we are going to start with Lewis to provide his initial presentation. We will next move to Shannon and then Claudia, and then we will have a question period. So with that introduction, I'll hand it over to Lewis.
Thank you very much, Eric. Good to be with both Claudia and Shannon and have a lively discussion about trade policy expectations and realities. The implication of the title of our conference is that the expectations and realities may be different. I think they are different in some respects. There is perhaps a surprising amount of continuity between the Trump trade policy that Eric accurately described and the Biden trade policy. In part, this can be explained as a holding action. The Biden administration is still coming to grips with a number of pressures on it, both from the Democratic base, which includes organized labor, and other key constituencies. Let me just see here. My screen seems to have frozen. There are quite a number of initiatives that are in play. The most recent one involves China. Just this week, the U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai gave a speech in Washington outlining sort of a new China strategy, but there isn't too much new about it. I think there's an effort to engage China in negotiations, but as yet there's no clear goal for those negotiations or consequences stated if the negotiations don't bear fruit. So we're still waiting for that. But there are the center of trade policy since Donald Trump is trade restrictions, using trade as leverage to negotiate with our trading partners and to elevate the concerns of the national government over those of private business. That seems to be continuing. The focus on trade, when they call it a worker-centric trade policy, I always think of myself as a working person, and my family is working family, but that seems to be not quite what the administration has in mind. They really are focused on jobs that are filled by organized, unionized workers, and those are in a decreasing percentage of the private economy in the United States. But there is that focus. So the main focus here is in the United States is, at least rhetorically, to increase domestic production of goods and to focus on bringing industries that have left the United States back to the United States in increasing measure. The means to achieve that are a little obscure without doing more harm than good. And I think the administration is still wrestling with that. So you look at the tariffs. There are three basic kinds of tariffs. There's anti-dumping, countervailing duties, and I would lump in those the safeguard cases. These are government-imposed restrictions, largely but not exclusively instigated by private industries wanting relief from import competition. Then there's Section 232, which has the same remedies, import restrictions, but with a focus on whether imports endanger United States national security. We have those tariffs on steel and aluminum. There have been several other cases, including one just initiated a couple of weeks ago on materials for certain batteries. And they continue. There were expectations that these 232 tariffs might be lifted. There are current negotiations with the European Union and the United Kingdom to lift them before the end of this year. I cannot report on the outcome of those negotiations, but we should know in a month or so. And then there's 301. Section 301 is the vehicle for China tariffs. There are rumors there might be a new 301 case on Chinese subsidies. So again, those tariffs are here. They are continuing, and in fact, as part of the Monday speech, Ambassador Tai announced a plan to reinstate an exclusions program, which suggests that when goods are only available from Chinese suppliers, the United States government will resume granting exclusions that will allow those U.S. companies to obtain the production inputs they need. It's a baby step so far, but I think, and we can discuss it further in the question time. So those are the basic functions. Those are the same elements that Donald Trump had in his administration. So the change is at best incremental from Trump to Biden on the trade strategy. That's the way I see it.
Great, thank you, Louis. Shannon, I'll turn it over to you. I think you're on mute, Shannon.
I am on mute. Do you have a specific question for me, or do you want me to?
Well, if you have comments to start with, and you can certainly expand on anything that Louis said. So I'll invite you to start off with any comments that you have.
Sure. Well, I think Louis really hit the nail on the head in terms of particularly when he noted the comment regarding continuity between the former administration and the current administration. And Louis, I believe you used the word holding, kind of like a holding pattern, which is how we've been referring to it as well. And we're certainly seeing this in many contexts. I think we talked a little bit yesterday on one of the panels regarding the opportunities that were out there for the administration, and whether the administration would move in and immediately start to roll back the policies that the previous administration had struck, and you're not seeing that, obviously. And as Louis noted, we're seeing a bit of a holding pattern as you have the administration also pulling folks in to fulfill the roles, and really trying to get a handle on where they want to have policy go. And I think certainly where we've seen this go is we've seen this certainly in the area of labor. When we talk about labor and we talk about American workers, as Louis indicated, from the actions we've seen to date, there really can be little question that the Biden administration is strongly committed to protecting, if not enhancing, the role of the American worker, while also focusing on really the plight of the worker overall. Having said that, it's important to note that many of the initiatives undertaken by the administration are not new, with the foundations really lying in activity commenced by both the Trump and the Obama administrations, as we've noted. I think you're seeing the mantra really be the American worker. We're seeing it in contexts where you wouldn't also necessarily see a nexus. For example, in the U.S., the U.S. Customs and Border Protection is launched a 21st Century Customs Framework, or it's known as 21 CCF. And in that framework, one of the pillars in that framework is, it says quite clearly, is protecting the American workers and business, and also focusing on ensuring fair competition and increasing transparency in the supply chain. So again, it's not quite where we would normally see a nexus, but to the American worker, but you're certainly seeing it in that regard. And part of the pillars of that program, as an example, includes ethical production methods, which I know we're going to discuss in just a few minutes, but including looking at the supply chain, looking globally at workers from that perspective as well, and really protecting and ensuring transparency and accountability in the supply chain. So it's not just protecting the workers here, but it's protecting the workers globally and ensuring that we have protection and taking action where we see that not being upheld for goods and other things that are moving into the U.S.
Great, thank you, Shannon. Claudia, I'll invite you to make any presentation comments. I think you're on mute.
Yeah. Well, very briefly, I just want to say that Mexico has always been close to the U.S. because of the geographic proximity. And that has meant historically to deal with a very intensive interdependence between both countries. Later on, I will expand on issues regarding NAFTA and the USMCA, but for now, as an introduction, I just want to highlight that Mexico needs the US and the US needs Mexico. So beyond any rhetorical policies between both countries, the relation is far more than government relations. There is a very dynamic movement every day in the US-Mexico border. A lot of companies participate between each other, people, families, culture, language. So the relationship will always be there. It's for the benefit of both governments to work on issues where we can have coincidences. Now with NAFTA, Mexico has been able to integrate very deeply in the North American production chains. So what we need is to find out how can we be more competitive, and Mexico's position is not necessarily to focus on made in the US, but made in North America, because we believe that competition is outside the region. Asian countries are organized by themselves. Europe is being also very competitive. So other regions are organizing by themselves. So why not we think about made in North America to align our public policies, trade policy, in order to be a team, not competitors between each other, but a team. So I'm going to talk to you later on about what NAFTA and the USMCA implies regarding this matter. But at the end of the day, Mexico is still competitive. We are still on the top 10 favorites for FDI, foreign direct investment, and one of them is the US, of course. So we are brothers, we are sisters, and we need to continue working together.
Thank you, Claudia. Well, I think all of you have raised some really interesting points. So let's do a little deeper dive into some of these issues that you've discussed. And Louis, you obviously are an expert on the area of trade remedies, which you discussed in your opening comments, and you've written extensively on trade remedies law and policy, drawing on your experience in legal practice. And you talked about how you expect the Biden administration for now is basically in a holding pattern and continuing to maintain the Trump tariffs and the use of the various trade remedies mechanisms. I just would like to ask if you could expand on some of that, including, the court decisions and what impact this is also having on the global rules-based trading system, in particular the WTO dispute settlement process. And do you see, looking even further afield, whether there are nuances, some differences between how the Biden administration is approaching these tools, and you just wrote recently that there is no evidence that the tariffs that Trump has put in place really had in the steel and aluminum really had any impact at all on global production in an effort to reduce capacity. So I just wanted to ask if you could do a little deeper dive on some of these questions. You're on mute. Louis, you're on mute. Louis, can you hear me? You're on mute.
The third speaker in a row that did that. Okay. I was intent on not doing that. So let me start with the anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws, which have been a fixture, in certain industries, and that's an expanding role. We now have anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases on a wide range of products, chemicals, solar panels and cells, and so forth. But when the law was passed for the first time in 1921, it was for the steel industry, and that's still pretty much what it's for. The Biden administration, just to illustrate how what degree of continuity there is, just last month published regulations that were drafted in proposed form by the Trump administration and issued last year before the election. And to the surprise of the assistant secretary under the Trump administration for these anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases, they were published basically unchanged by the Biden administration just last month. They toughen up certain anti-dumping. I'll throw out names, and it may be that may raise questions about what these are, but things like the scope of an anti-dumping case, what products are covered, circumvention by moving production from one country to another to escape anti-dumping and countervailing duties, and something called new shipper reviews, where companies that are new to the industry can receive expedited analysis of their anti-dumping and countervailing duty situation so that maybe they can be more competitive in important markets. Those are all harder now because of these new rules. So importers are more likely to be excluded from the U.S. market because of these new rules. And Biden published the old Trump rules. And that's to me kind of a signal. On Section 232, there has been a lot of litigation. The courts are generally very kind to the breadth of executive authority that the Trump administration claimed, and now the Biden administration is claiming. Full disclosure, I'm involved in some major litigation there, so I don't want you to think I'm unbiased about it. But I see those arguments in the Biden administration echoing the position that the Trump administration took. Right now we have negotiations. The U.S. The administration didn't want to do these negotiations, but Europe sort of forced their hand. They were putting some doubling of tariffs, including Kentucky bourbon, as retaliation for 232, effective June 1st. They agreed to a 6-month delay to December 1st in order to negotiate removal of the 232 tariffs as concerning the European Union. Those are still going on. How that comes out, we don't know. But I think the U.S. Wants greater cooperation from the EU and the UK, which is tagging along in these negotiations against China, the developing China policy. And they're also concerned, on the other hand, about swing states in 2022, including some big steel states. So how this comes out is anybody's guess. Will it be more like Canada and Mexico? In other words, no tariffs, or I should add Australia too. Or will it be more like Brazil, Korea, Argentina, which have binding quotas on imports? Don't know. I think there's going to be something for each side in all likelihood. But in order to get Europe not to impose these doubling of tariffs, the U.S. is going to have to make some concessions, I believe. In China, I've mentioned this already. There is huge litigation on the China Section 301 duties. The latter cases, what's called List 3 and List 4A, that impose tariffs late. the question of whether the USTR complied with the statute. Nearly 4,000 cases have been filed questioning these tariffs. Again, I'm involved in that litigation, but I think every lawyer in Washington just about is involved in it. We'll see how that goes. The U.S. has made, the government has made a strategic retreat in the last couple of months on an arcane issue about liquidation of entries, and Shannon can talk more about that. But we'll see how all that goes. The tariffs, though, there's been no inkling that the tariffs would be rescinded or changed in any fundamental way, except as the result, perhaps, of litigation. And even that is not going to have ongoing consequences. If the government loses the case, they can fix it. So it's the China tariffs are there. The negotiations that the U.S. is trying to commence with China don't show any signs of near-term success. And the U.S. has already announced they're not going to negotiate a phase 2 agreement with China. So they're still going after them for not complying with phase 1. So all of that suggests that the administration will remain tough on trade remedies. They're not going to stage any kind of strategic retreat. The main concern is that there are more people affected adversely in the United States from these tariffs than are helped. And I do believe there is work going on in that respect to try to make the tariffs as tough on China and other trading partners as possible, without doing so much damage to U.S. industries. The longer these tariffs remain in effect, the more that companies see that they'll be there. They're going to make investment decisions and the location of production decisions that could have long-term impact on the industries the U.S. government is trying to help. Also, all of those things are up in the air. And I think the basic thrust is tariffs in some form or quotas are going to be around for a while. It's economic nationalism. The end of the Cold War is long in the past, and economic nationalism seems to be increasing. As Claudia said, maybe you can have regional nationalism instead of strict nationalism. But there is this notion that we're competing with other regions, other countries, and that we have to do more to be effective in that.
Thanks. Yes, obviously, the U.S. system of trade remedies has long been criticized as being unpredictable. I guess to the extent that it is predictable, it's that the petitioner generally wins. But for companies that are facing trade remedies actions for importers, it's a very unpredictable system in the United States, and it sounds like it's only moving more in that direction, which I guess will clearly have some implications for the global competitiveness of U.S. industries and quite frankly, North American too. Shannon or Claudia, I don't know if you have any additional comments on, following up on Lewis. If you do, please chime in. If not, I'll move on to my next question.
No, I just one comment on that. I think Lewis is absolutely right. I mean, this notion that we're competing against other regions and that we need to look and work very closely and align and come up with ways to really strengthen the supply chain and look at ways that the regions can work together. I think that is definitely prevalent. The fact of the matter, though, is I don't think it's an us versus them situation. I think it's a situation where you have companies that are looking at their supply chains globally, and they're trying to look to make sure, because of some of these things that we're talking about, look to make sure they have options in terms of their sourcing. And so I think where you've seen, historically you saw a shift over to Asia. Now you're seeing maybe a shift back or maybe a shift in the middle. So I think it's going to be really interesting to watch how this all plays out.
Claudia, any thoughts?
No, I mean, just highlighting what I said. Why just limit us to a country nationalism as made in Mexico, made in Canada? Why not make in North America? Because we have all the legal framework for that. And production chains are not new. They have been created along 25 years when NAFTA was put into effect. So why don't we take advantage of these and focus on a regional goal instead of fighting with each other, no?
Yeah. Well, Shannon, why don't I'd like to turn to your comments on the labor issues and the Biden administration's labor-oriented trade policy, and some of the I guess challenges that creates also for companies on compliance and so forth. We've seen that U.S. Customs and Border Protection has been taking a much more aggressive approach in enforcing rules targeting products that are alleged to have been made with forced labor. And there's a continued call by the administration on putting American workers first. Just wanted to ask if you could expand a little bit more on this and talk about what the consequences of that are for American companies who are facing these compliance challenges. And it's not only on forced labor, but it's the whole issue of illicit trade generally.
Sure. No, that's exactly right. I mean, from a forced labor perspective, interestingly enough, the law that created the impetus to more aggressively pursue those I'll use the term bad actor because that's a term that we like to use quite often, but are using and or benefiting from forced labor was actually passed in 2015 when President Obama was still in office. And similarly, the enforcement of the law that expanded under President Trump with, as you noted in your opening remarks, a strong protectionist bent, which was the America First, as it's been labeled, was really intended to prioritize the U.S. worker and the sourcing and production of goods within U.S. borders. And whether that's manifest through the bias created under USMCA, a bias that remains championed by President Biden, are proposed increases in enforcement of Buy American requirements. Again, an action initiated under President Trump, but it's being further prodded by President Biden, or enhanced and targeted export controls and constraints on foreign investment. The protectionist mindset really continues to foster. And although perhaps not all of these are not specifically focused on labor in particular and the promotion of the U.S. worker, with each action, I think, that is undertaken by the U.S. government protecting the interests of the workforce has definitely been championed, which I alluded to in the opening remarks. And when you're looking at something like forced labor as the example, in the past several years, the U.S. has really dramatically increased forced labor enforcement, as you noted, Eric, with U.S. Customs and Border Protection being more and more aggressive in terms of going after those bad actors and making sure it identifies companies that may use forced labor in their supply chain. And I think it reflects really the U.S.'s commitment against the use of forced labor, regardless of the circumstance. The road's not been a smooth one, though, as the war being waged against forced labor has really resulted, I think, for companies in an uneven approach toward merchandise detention, which has certainly been a challenge. You talk about the challenges that companies are facing. That's certainly one. As part of that, you have a documentation review process, and an ultimate determination of the presence of forced labor in the underlying supply chain. So U.S. Customs has a process that they work through if there's a suspicion of forced labor where the merchandise is detained until a determination is made. Obviously, as part of that process, companies have, as I mentioned, a very elaborate documentation and a review process that they must go through. I think one of the challenges we're seeing is it's almost a learn by doing, in that U.S. Customs is continuing to refine that process. And this is actually an area when we talk about foreign trade zones and free trade zones where the foreign trade zones have actually been very beneficial to companies. The National Association of Foreign Trade Zones work very closely with U.S. Customs to enable goods that were suspected to be able to be put into a foreign trade zone while it was undergoing that review process. That was actually something that was very helpful to companies. And we worked very hard to do that because at the onset, that was not the case. So just as an example, but there's also been a strong political element, as we all know, with respect to China and more specifically sourcing in the Xinjiang region, which really, from a forced labor perspective, has been the disproportionate focus to date. We have a continuing broadening of customs pursuit of forced labor, and it's expected, but the U.S. continues to really, refine the use of the tool. And I think what you're going to see is, I think you're going to see more of a regulatory framework in some fashion come down on that, because right now it's, as I mentioned, the process has really been evolving. And U.S. Customs is trying to work to do that with companies. And it presents a real challenge for companies because you have challenges depending on the item or depending on the industry. U.S. Customs may be taking one approach for this type of commodity versus another approach for a different commodity. So I think consistency, as I mentioned, has really been a challenge. There's also significant support from Congress there's been a variety of legislation that's been introduced with a focus on protecting, if not enhancing, the U.S. workforce overall. That includes not only actions against forced labor, but also initiatives to support and improve U.S. competitiveness, particularly given the weaknesses in the supply chain, which we've seen as a result of COVID and the pandemic. The shortages that we've seen in terms of the available components and materials, microchips being the first and foremost that comes to mind when you're looking at sourcing, and bottlenecks presenting, that have prevented not only offloading of shipped goods, but even securing of transport from one point of origin to the United States. And I think, it's kind of like the perfect storm of events that are going on, which are presenting huge challenges for companies. And I think it's causing folks to really, again, we keep going back to sourcing. And I think it's really causing folks to relook at their strategy for their organizations and their companies, their sourcing patterns, the partners that they work with, how they've historically looked at, many companies, go into their supply chains and they work with suppliers on a long-term basis. They don't go into it on an immediate need, right? They want to establish a relationship and work with those partners on a long-term basis. And I think what you're seeing is this is causing companies to even relook at that. They're having to look at those long-term suppliers, relook at them, and determine whether or not they can support or defend as necessary any allegation that may be waged for something like a forced labor type of situation. So I think that really presents a challenge. It also obviously presents opportunities, again, as we go back and look to this idea of a regional basis and moving outside of a traditional sourcing model. So we'll see how that plays out, but it definitely is a challenge as we move forward.
Thanks, Shannon. Any further comments from our other panelists on that? Okay.
No,
all right. Well, I have a question for Claudia then. I'd like to ask you to expand on your opening comments on trade relations in North America, and specifically what the perspective is in Mexico on the USMCA and the more restrictive rules under that agreement compared to NAFTA, particularly on rules of origin, what those portend for cross-border trade and the global competitiveness, particularly in the automotive sector in North America.
Well, thank you, Eric. I would like to give a brief context. As I said before, given the geographic proximity and historical interdependence between the two countries for many decades, Mexico's trade relation with the U.S. has represented more than 80% share of the country's total foreign trade. NAFTA just represented a legal framework that provided certainty to Mexico, mitigating the risk of unilateral decisions affecting our exports to the U.S. For instance, before NAFTA, Mexico used to face non-tariff barriers for apparently sanitary reasons, dumping prices, etc. And NAFTA generated clear rules, low import tariffs, and above all, the novelty of trinational courts to handle trade disputes. And during the more than 25 years of NAFTA, the Mexican industry was able to move from labor-intensive sectors such as apparel or footwear to high value-added industries such as automotive, aerospace, or medical devices, among others. And at the same time, Mexican exports went from 80% concentration of oil resources to 80% share of manufacturing goods. So this is clear that Mexico was successfully integrated into the North American production chains, becoming also an important player for global value chains, with more jobs and new best practices for the country's benefit. Now, trade between Mexico and the US grew from $82 billion in 1994, when NAFTA entered into effect, to more than $600 billion in 2018, when the USMCA started, and this means an increase of more than 600% in all these years. Today, Mexico continues to be among the top 10 recipient countries of foreign direct investment, and the USMCA is the NAFTA reloaded, in line with the world's mega trends. Although the new agreement did not have profound changes in comparison to NAFTA spirit, modifications will certainly have an impact, or are having already an impact, in Mexican export companies. Just to give you an idea, the USMCA contains 34 chapters in relation to the 22 chapters in NAFTA. So we are talking about incorporating digital commerce, e-commerce, that did not exist before when NAFTA was negotiated, environment issues, climate change, technical standards, anti-corruption, and labor market new practices, among other changes. Well, despite the rhetoric policies from the Trump administration during the USMCA negotiations, the result had a minimal impact on Mexican exports, which for 2019 continued to grow, given the solid market demand on the US market. I mean, we depend a lot on the US market. And that indeed, the change in rule of origins, as you were mentioning, Eric, mainly in the automotive industry, represents a significant challenge, as the production chains must gradually adapt to this new modality. More in detail, in 7 years for light vehicles and in 10 years for heavy vehicles, there will be a transition from national content of 62.5% to 75%. Apart from other regulations regarding components, type of materials, and salary levels. Experts believe that in the short term, the rules of origin may represent higher expenses for companies operating in Mexico, not only Mexican companies, but foreign companies operating in the country, because they must adjust their supply chain. Still, in the long term, it will mean an opportunity for Mexico to increase national content, helping small and medium-sized companies, local companies, to be integrated in these regional chains and to attract new foreign companies, increasing FDI inflows. After all, the automotive industry has always been one of the most benefited from trade integration in North America. Remember, from Canada to the US and Mexico, all these companies are located in this production highway. And to give you an example, in 1994, Mexico produced over 1 million vehicles, generally speaking, exporting about 52% of total, while in 2019, the national production almost tripled to 3.7 million cars, and export increased from 52 to 88 share of the total exports in this industry. So these adjustments will represent important challenges for the more than 19 vehicle plants operating in Mexico. Most of the brands, global brands, are located in Mexico because they will have to adapt their commercial and supply strategies to comply with all these new regulations. But despite everything, Mexico remains a competitive country and a significant player for the US, as I was saying before. Both countries share a common border of around 2,000 miles. This is about 3,500 kilometers, with more than 1 million US border crossings per day. For Mexico, this means improving lead time, eliminating container shipments, and some same-day deliveries, being highly cost competitive compared to other countries. And in terms of trade, Mexico is today the U.S. largest trade partner, with a bilateral trade of around $375 billion for the first half of this current year, 2021, equivalent to almost 15% of total U.S. trade. And about investment, the pandemic crisis showed how integrated North American supply chains are and how new opportunities arise for partnership and investment and nearshoring. The U.S. is Mexico's top source of foreign direct investment, as I said, and meaning more than 70% share of all FDI to Mexico. Another data, about 18,000 U.S. companies are already operating in Mexico, and more than 45% of raw materials used in Mexican manufacturing facilities are sourced from the U.S. So these are only some examples to learn about this interdependence that I was mentioning before. So given the trade and investment interdependence between the two countries, we believe, in general terms, that the Biden administration will continue the good commercial relationship between both countries. So the implementation of the USMCA will continue to ride in the right track. Well, this is generally speaking my opinion.
Thank you, Claudia. Well, we are coming to the last few minutes of the session, but I thought I'd throw out a general question for everybody. You know, it's evident that we are moving toward a much more restrictive and trading policy, you know, with more economic nationalism and managed trade. And this is all intended to achieve certain policy goals like building jobs in the United States when we're talking about U.S. trade policy, moving manufacturing here, protecting American industries, and so forth. Is this really, are all these more restrictive actions, whether it be on trade remedies or on corporate social responsibility or rules of origin, really having, are they really effective in achieving the policy goals? And are we looking at basically the demise of the post-war Bretton Woods system focused on free trade and the basic concepts of the rules-based trading system like national treatment and most favored nation? So that's a big question to cover in just a few minutes, but I thought I'd throw that out for any thoughts that you have on that.
Well, Eric, I'm sorry. Luis?
Go ahead, Claudia.
Okay, just briefly. I believe that the spirit of those values are still on, but the world has changed a lot. Now we have the internet, social media, the media communication, the cloud, and manufacturing 4.0. So all these things obligate us as countries and as governments to reorganize our ideas, but not to forget about the original purpose, which is to increase the quality of life of people, of population, and now to care about the climate change. All these problems that are affecting all the world needs to be considered in the agenda.
Yeah, and I think building on that, I agree completely with Claudia. The world has changed so much since 1993 when the WTO agreements were negotiated. And with the exception of a few sectors like information technology, there hasn't been a negotiation that concluded successfully since then. And that's because there are global problems that the machinery of the global system can't solve, and it's frustrating. Climate change is one of them, and the basic WTO framework, which is when countries violate the rules, the agreed to rules, there are consequences. That was established really for the first time in the WTO agreements. And the United States was the chief instigator of destroying that system. The system is now destroyed. It's a pile of rubble. So countries can, without fear of serious adverse consequences other than publicity, violate the agreement, the rules that they negotiated. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, I think people can differ about. But we don't have a new system ready to take its place. And yet we have enormous global problems that aren't reflected in the private sector ways of doing business. Shannon alluded to, forced labor. China has been seriously accused of major violations of forced labor rules. Countries have their own rules about that. The United States has their own. They are often not enforced. They're only enforced under domestic pressure and bad publicity. So it's to say it's an imperfect system is a gross understatement. Climate change the same way. We're going to have a summit in November, and it will undoubtedly be a shouting match between developing countries and advanced countries, each of which wants the other group to do more to solve the problem. Those issues will maintain until they reach a point of no return. And we're in a situation where the systems that we've devised since the end of the Second World War are not working or have been dismantled, and there is very little discussion about replacing them with anything other than my country first, or my region first, or my ideology first. And these problems transcend all of those things. I don't want to sound overly pessimistic, but at the moment, I'm looking for someone or some group to think about these things in a constructive way, so we look for solutions that will actually address these problems effectively.
Thanks, Louis. Shannon, I'll give you a few seconds to have the last word.
Sure, and I'll move quickly. I know we're at the end, but we can't follow the rules just when it suits us. Claudia talked about everyone and looking at workers and lifting everyone up, right? A rising tide, and I think that has to be the mantra. I think Louis talked about the fact that there's no system that's ready to step in right now, and that system does need to be devised. And I do think that the fact of the matter is that we do have social media, and we do have that pressure that can come to bear that's different than what we had before, and I think we really do need to keep looking outward, not just inward, if we're going to be successful from a global perspective.
Well, thank you. I think we've basically reached the end of our time. So thank you very much, Louis, Shannon, and Claudia, for your very interesting comments on some very challenging issues.
Thank you very much to the organizers.
Gracias,
congratulations. Gracias a todos. Hasta luego.
Gracias a todos.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you also to your guests, Luis, Shannon, and Claudia, for your insights. Vamos a hacer una breve pausa ahora. A partir de las 4 en punto de la tarde, no os perdáis la inspirational speaker Andrea Vilallonga con su charla Positive Activism. Andrea, os aseguro que no deja nunca indiferentes. Y a partir de las 5, última sesión del día sobre Eurasia desde este plato. Hasta ahora.